Next month, my co-host Ali Shandlin is joining an array of experts for a weekend of talks and debate on the Middle East. The event takes place in Weston Park, a magnificent stately home in the UK, between the 23rd and 25th of March. Other speakers include the New York Times Tehran correspondent Thomas Erdbrink and Nicholas Blandford, the Beirut-based journalist. The event is being organised by the UK travel company Political Tours. Stay tuned for more details about the event at the end of this podcast.
This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I am your host, Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers, researchers, documentary filmmakers, and other people of all trades and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. I'm joined here in the studio by Dr. Jonathan Rubin, who is a historian of the Medieval Levant, or the Holy Land, at the Tel Aviv University. He specializes in the production of knowledge in the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in the 12th and 13th centuries. Hello, Yoni, and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad, thank you.
So in your research, you focus on revisiting a common assumption in your field, and that is that the production of knowledge in this region was relatively inferior to the other frontiers of Christendom at the time, namely Sicily and the Iberian Peninsula, where European Christians came in contact with other churches and other religions altogether. So I'd like to start here and say that it seems to me completely counterintuitive. It's not the fact that Jerusalem yielded less knowledge than other places, but rather the fact that there was any kind of contact or interaction or intellectual crossover at all there in other places, because, to my mind at least, the Crusaders didn't come to integrate and learn and be inspired, but rather to impose themselves and their views.
Okay, yeah. So this is really a place where we see a great gap between what historians know and what more general audiences know, because as far as historians are concerned, we know for a long time that one of the major trends in the 12th century in the intellectual history is really a process in which, when the Latins met Islam, especially in Iberia, one of the things they were concerned with is a great project of translation of Arabic works into Latin. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Muslim world had Aristotle and had many scientific works translated from Greek around 800. Okay, so they had this kind of stuff for centuries. The Westerners, when they came into contact with the Muslims, again, especially in Iberia and to a lesser extent in Sicily, they learned that the Muslim world has a lot to offer in terms of philosophy, in terms of mathematics, in terms of astrology, which was a sort of scientific field. And they started translating works.
But how did it square with the very fundamental belief that the Islamic world is the center of heresy? Because, the religion was the benchmark at the time. So how could those Western Christians in the Middle Ages, could see the Muslims as, on the one hand, completely heretical, and on the other hand, holding some sort of truth and knowledge?
Well, the Latins actually deal with this point, and they try to make a distinction. Okay, so for example, one thing would be the argument that you sometimes find in texts that the Muslim scholars don't really believe Islam. They sort of play it out, but they don't actually believe it. They're much too clever to believe it. So you find these kinds of things in texts. But in any case, the Latins, or it's not the Latins, but there were enough Latins who were very interested in discovering Muslim knowledge and taking it into the Latin world. Perhaps the most important is Gerard of Cremona. It's an Italian guy, and he's very interested in the work by Ptolemy from the ancient world. Okay, so Greek work in astronomy, and he hears in Cremona, in Italy, he hears that he can find this work in Toledo. So he goes to Toledo, and there he translates it, or is helped by people probably, but he translates it from Arabic into Latin. And then he discovers that, except Ptolemy, they have a tremendous number of important works in Arabic in Toledo. So he...
that was in the 9th century or thereabouts?
No, in the 12th century.
In 12th
so this is a part
right.
of the trend I'm talking about. So what he does is actually move his life over there, and he spends all his life translating works from Arabic into Latin. And these texts will have a major effect. In medicine, the things that he translated would dominate university education till the 17th century. So so you see, for historians, it's quite clear that one of the major trends in the European intellectual history is that in the 12th and 13th centuries, there's a massive process of translation of works from Arabic into Latin, and that actually transformed the whole European intellectual world. The entrance of Aristotle, the Aristotelian corpus, into Europe had major effects on this cultural world, again, for centuries.
Did it do anything to rattle the foundations of Christian belief, the canonic Christian belief? Can we see this as a precursor to the Protestant faith and other contrarian currents within Christendom?
Well, I would put it differently. What we see is a challenge to Christianity and to Catholicism, and there was definitely a challenge. So the works of Aristotle get into the Latin world, and then it's sort of, what are we doing with this? One of the major problems with Aristotle is that he did not believe that the world was created. He thought that the world was eternal. Okay, so now this is a problem. So the Latin theologians admire Aristotle greatly, but then they have a problem with this question. And by the way, Maimonides had exactly the same problem. When he writes in his Guide of the Perplexed, he engages with this exact problem. Okay, so both Judaism and Christianity had to cope with the introduction of Aristotle. Okay, so yeah, this was definitely a challenge. They couldn't ignore it, but they had to do a lot of work in order to adapt it into either Judaism and Christianity.
So let's shift the focus to our part of the world, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Why did historians think that the production of knowledge here was inferior, and where do you think they were wrong?
Okay, so firstly, they were not completely wrong, and I'll say in a minute why. But the reason that they thought that very little information was transferred from the Muslim or Arabic world into the Latin world is that, as I said, in Toledo we have dozens of translations from Arabic into Latin. And when you look at what happened in our part of the world, there's hardly any. Okay, so they looked at it, we can say, in a rather formal way, and they said, okay, here we have a giant corpus of translations, here we hardly have any. So that probably means that nothing was going on. They were also, I think, led to think this way by the fact that in this part of the world there was a lot of fighting going on. A lot of it was religion motivated, let's say. So
and also Spain was a cultural and intellectual hub, whereas in Jerusalem wasn't quite on the same level.
Yes, absolutely. So actually I see that as one of the explanations of the difference between what happened there and what happened here. But usually what you find in books is that people here were interested in either fighting a religious war, or when they were not doing that, they were busy making money. Okay, like the Venetians or people like that who were merchants who were motivated by making money.
Yeah.
Okay, so usually the argument that you find is that you didn't have here the kind of people who would have been interested in accumulating knowledge from the Arabic world.
Did it have a lot to offer in terms of knowledge?
So exactly, this is one of the questions, and I think that actually one of the explanations for the fact that what was happening here was rather limited is not what you find often in books, that so the Crusaders were not receptive. Okay, that's a thing that you find in books. I don't think they were not receptive. I think that when they conquered the Holy Land, actually the Holy Land had less books to offer than Toledo, for example. Toledo, Muslim Toledo, okay, till it was conquered by the Latins, was a main intellectual center. Jerusalem was not an intellectual center in the centuries before 1099, the conquest by the First Crusade, and the intellectuals who did live in it and did write books were people who were concerned with Islam, okay, with Quranic exegeses, with Muslim law, okay, but you didn't have mathematicians working here, you didn't have important physicians working here, okay, so when they came, they simply found a very limited corpus of books. So I think that's actually one of the keys to this very crucial difference between the regions.
Can you draw the line and really distinguish between theological polemic, those religious Christians who came here to polemicize with Islam, and other perhaps more mundane sort of knowledge? You mentioned medicine and science and maths and other fields.
Yeah, so I think as far as the activity in the Latin Kingdom, the intellectual activity or the fields that interested people, you can put on the one hand interest in religion, okay, which would be divided really into interest in Islam, and not less importantly, but quite neglected, interest in the whole group of or groups of Oriental Christians, which the Latins met here for the first time. Okay, so when a Latin bishop comes here, he has a chance to meet Armenians, he has a chance to meet Copts, Ethiopians, okay, Maronite, a whole range of Christian...
What was their attitude towards them? I mean, they weren't quite heretical as the Muslims, but I mean, it was kind of they were in limbo, no pun intended.
Yeah, well, it's really problematic. It's a very complex question. It also depends on the groups. Generally, we can say that the Latins were rather hostile towards the Greek Orthodox, which were the main group and which were strongly related, of course, to the Byzantine Empire. So they were rather hostile toward them. They were more friendly to smaller groups like the Jacobites, like the Copts.
Because they were less threatened by them politically?
Yes, I think that basically, yes. Because actually, theologically, theoretically, they were supposed to be closer to the Greek Orthodox because they're not monophysites, whereas the Copts are. So it's it's a more political.
Right.
It's the reason is more political than theological. So, but yeah, the relation was quite complex. On the one hand, these are not Muslims. On the other hand, they did not benefit from the same, let's say, the legal status of Latins. So what you had is actually formally in the Latin Kingdom, there was the status of the Latins, and the second status was a common one to Jews, Muslims, and Oriental Christians.
Right.
So that's sort of surprising, I think, that the Oriental Christians were in the same legal status as Muslims and Jews, at least formally.
And theologically, what does this sort of dialogue with the Eastern churches produce? Did it enrich the Latins in any way?
Yeah, so that's one of the main things I've been working on. And yes, I think that one of the let's say the main focuses or main aspects of intellectual activity in the Latin East was actually a process of members of clergy, Latin members of clergy coming here, being very interested in these groups and trying to talk with them and learn from them, sometimes in a more friendly manner, and sometimes, in particular, in later decades, toward the end of the 13th century, in a more hostile manner. But definitely, I think there was a process of learning about these groups.
Can you give an example?
Jacques de Vitry, who was the Bishop of Acre around 1220, was a very well-educated member of clergy. He eventually became a cardinal, so this is a very important figure in the church. And he came here, and you see both in a letter that he wrote to friends of his in Paris and in a book that he wrote, at least much of, while in Acre, or planned at least parts of it in Acre, you see his interest in these groups. And he says, I asked a Coptic guy about this, and he told me that and that. So you see that he's accumulating knowledge. And what's very significant here, I think, is that this information, this letter, was sent to Paris to very well-educated people. So for me, this is an indication that this knowledge was not well known in the West. Otherwise, he would not have needed to send it to friends of his. And these friends, again, are people with very well trained in theology. So he must have been collecting here information which was unavailable yet in the West. So yes, I think that in this field, at least, there was some significant contribution to the, let's say, the Western body of knowledge.
Very interesting. Now, I'd like to move to the more practical aspect of this intellectual crossover and focus on medicine, because in medicine there was a common interest, perhaps a pragmatic interest, to better the lives of people per se, regardless of their religion. The polemical element of the theological crossover was absent.
Yes, absolutely. So I think medicine, and that's something that I've been working on for last year or two. I think that medicine is a good field in which to check these kind of crossovers, exactly because of what you say. It's a programmatic field, but also because it's geographically specific. And I'll say what I mean. One of the fields, or the field I've been focusing on, is what we call materia medica. We're talking about the substances which were used for medicine. It could be plants, it could be minerals, and it could be parts of animals. Now, this is at least partly geographically specific, because when the Crusaders come here, they obviously meet, or they see for the first time, plants that they didn't see elsewhere, animals that they didn't see earlier. And that's the reason, I think, that they would have wanted to learn from local practitioners about these substances. Mm-hmm. It's also, medicine is also specifically geographical from another point of view. Some of the diseases which the Crusaders suffered from here were specific, to warmer areas. Yeah. So you have both new medical problems and potential for new medical solutions. And another point is that materia medica are also things that have an economic potential. Okay, some of them are very expensive. Okay, and we know that, for example, in the port of Acre, medical substances would have been traded on the way to the West. Right. Okay, so when you trade something, you want to be able to say, this is good for this kind of disease, and this is very good for that kind of, of medical problems. Yeah. So you would have learned a lot.
Was there any kind of medical treatment that was born here and transformed any type of medicine in the West?
Yeah. So. One thing I wrote about is about the history of the Theriac. Now, the Theriac is a very old remedy. It appears already in Greek and Roman medicine. But what happened here is that when the Latins came here, they saw for the first time that the Arab practitioners, in order to prepare the Theriac, are using a specific snake from the Dead Sea region. Okay, so then we can follow a process by which the Latins adopt this practice of using this particular snake from the Dead Sea area for the production of the Theriac. And we can also follow this in medical texts and medical encyclopedias or encyclopedias in the West, because you see that this snake starts to appear in such texts really during the period we're talking about. And there's really a development of an understanding that you can't make the Theriac without this poor snake from the Dead Sea region. Okay, so this is a very specific element which I've been able to trace down. Now, it might look like a very marginal thing, But first of all, it's indicative, I think, because you can follow the whole process of, Arabic practitioners having a certain local practice, Latins coming and picking it up, that process being transferred to the most important centers of medicine in the West. And when you follow this, you also see that this had a great economic potential because these snakes seem to have been very, very expensive.
Right.
To the extent that one of our texts says that the Mamluk Sultan prohibits its trade because he doesn't want it to become extinct. I mean, he wants to have this important resource continually in his territories. Okay, so I think this is a little story, but it is quite, I think, a significant indication of something going on.
Mm-hmm. How fascinating. But I'm afraid we're out of time, Dr. Jonathan Rubin, historian of the Medieval Levant or the Holy Land at Tel Aviv University. Thank you very much for coming in. It was really interesting.
Thank you, Gilad.
And a quick note before we end the show. I will be joining Thomas Erdbrink of the New York Times, he's the Tehran correspondent, and a range of other experts in March for a weekend of discussion on the Middle East in the wonderful surroundings of Weston Park, a stately British home. The event takes place between Friday, March 23rd to Sunday, March 25th, and it is being organized by UK travel specialists Political Tours. I'll be discussing Israel-Iranian relations with Thomas Erdbrink. We'll be joined by Nicholas Blandford, the Beirut-based writer who is widely acknowledged as one of the leading experts on Hezbollah. And beyond the Middle East speakers, we will discuss North Korea and the foreign policy vacuum in Washington. The weekend includes 2 nights stay, all meals, and complete use of the house, which has previously served as the venue for the Northern Ireland peace talks and a G8 summit. If you'd like more details, please visit www.politicaltours.com or email info@politicaltours.com. Thank you.
Also, big thanks to the technical producers of this show, Leo Peleg, Adam Scher, and Sagi Gorali Ventura. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. Until then, do not forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And do not hesitate to get in touch, Gilad, G-I-L-A-D, at tlv1.fm with your comments and suggestions. Thank you very much. I hope to be joined by you again next week. And until then, goodbye.